refresh your browser MMO game, Code with Me. So let's break this down here. You'll notice I've put it in the Deuteros tag. I was a big fan of a game called Deuteros. In fact, I think I have a walkthrough here. So if you've ever played the game on the Amiga, or I think the ST as well, this was a popular game for very, very nerdy people back in the day, which was me. And I just loved the fact that it wasn't one of these all-out action games. It was very much a strategy game first, and with all the different screens that you could go to and the developments. And yeah, I just loved it. It was just screens after screen of different data aggregated in different ways, and it just worked for me. Yeah, really great game. Now, apparently, there was a prequel to this called Millennium 2.2, and I never played this. And because I played Deuteros first, I um, I kind of just didn't really want to go back to that. And I've been looking at kind of some of the screens on this. Just didn't look to have the same feel as Deuteros, so I was kind of like, didn't really want to ruin it for myself, so I never went back. So I've kind of read information about it, what was the point of the game, the premise of it and stuff. And then obviously I mean, this game I finished, a really good game, really enjoyed it. Gets a bit samey after a while when you get to the later game where you're just trying to find a strategy to defeat the aliens, but I mean, even so, back in the day, really loved it, really enjoyed that. So that's why we're in the Deuteros camp, because I had an idea for a game. I wasn't quite sure how to put a backdrop on it, what I was going to do to put a backdrop on it. And I thought, well, what I was planning to do actually fits quite nicely in between Millennium 2.2 and Deuteros when it comes to timeline. So Millennium 2.2, as you can see by the name, is in roughly in the year, well, the 2200. So you're in the year 2200. Deuteros was in the year 3100, so 900 years later. So in 2200, you make your way back to Earth after an asteroid has hit it or something. The Martian, the moon colony goes back to Earth. That's the aim of the game. So then, for a period of time, you're on Earth, and then in 3100, the premise for Deuteros is that mankind wants to reach out back into the solar system again. So there's that period of time which I thought, could we do something that's Earth-based that kind of fits quite nicely in between these two storylines? And the idea I had was to kind of use the map system that we have. Now, the maps, you can access maps for developer purposes for all around the world. And the thing about the UK is, because it's a relatively small place, there's two ways you can do the coordinates. You can do it through latitude, longitude, and you can do it through easting, northing. Now, the advantage of latitude, longitude is the maps, if you're using something like Leaflet.js, which is like a map layer to integrate your maps into your JavaScript, latitude, longitude just slot in dead easy, really easy to do. But you have to use special formulas to work out distances, because the formulas are designed to work over huge data distances on a curved surface. Whereas the easting and northing that the Ordnance Survey uses for their maps is just a grid based. So you're basically just using Pythagoras theorem rather than the Haversine formula. So it just made it a lot easier for me to manually calculate distances. So I thought, well, I'd like to kind of do one or the other, but in previous incarnations of this idea, I have done both. I've put both sets of data in the locations, and I've used the latitude, longitude to inject it into a map, and I've used the easting, northing to calculate distances, because it's just the square root of the two adjacent sides of a triangle, isn't it? The distance, it's Pythagoras theorem. So that's kind of where I'm going with this. But I thought this is going to be a slow discussion. I'm not particularly quick at typing, so I don't expect this to rattle through this. But I also want this to be me thinking out loud. I want you to maybe get not just, oh, this is a solution, this is an answer. I want to kind of think out loud as a developer why I've come to that conclusion, why I might think like that, so that you can get a bit of an insight as to how a developer thinks, if ever that was something you'd want. So that's kind of where we're going with this. So we're going to spend, I've allocated 3 hours for today. No idea how long this is going to take, but let's just see how we get on. So to start with, off screen, I have been setting up the site. I just need to check that my local Docker is working, so you can't see this, but just please bear with me. So what I'm going to do is go into my code and just go to my Docker Compose here. I'm just going to call it, I had an idea for a game, so Earth 2900. I thought that fit in nicely with the two naming conventions here. So I'm going to call it Earth 2900, and I think everything else is fine. While I don't have anything sensitive in my .m file, I'm happy to open that up, but I am going to call this Earth 2900 test, and then because I've changed the name in the Docker, I have to just add another thing here. App service, and just get rid of that protocol there. There we go. So that should get me up and running. Oh, let me just there we go. So that should work now if I close those two down. So let me have a talk through what my plan is here. I'm going to be installing Inertia, by the way. That was the other thing on the title that I put on. And the reason for that is I don't know if I'll ever finally create this game as a final game. But if I do, it probably won't be in Inertia. But I've found Inertia is just a great way to prototype stuff up very quickly. You get all your authentication pages. If you like Vue and you do it through the Jetstream system in Laravel, it's just a very quick way of prototyping. And you get access to all the Laravel infrastructure. So that's the only reason why I'm using it. I've been looking at maybe learning some of the stuff like Symfony, which I did a long time ago, but it's kind of come on a long way since then. I've also been looking at Kivy on the Python one to create mobile apps. That's an interesting one, so that might be something I do. But I think just for prototyping, I think Inertia is just a really good, relatively quick way to get things up and running. Now, I've already added the domain to my local etc hosts file, so I'm hoping now if I go to ignore the remote domain, that's where I was working on my last version of this. So I'm hoping that this works. We get a Laravel sign up. There we go. Job done, and we have our site. Let me just see what percentage we're at. Oh, we're quite zoomed in. Okay. Okay. Sweet. So we have our site up and running. I've got it in mobile view as well, just to save space. I'm working on this really big monitor, which is superb, except it's really small. The actual space I can stream on this is probably just slightly over half the width of it, and so I've kind of squashed everything up into that top left corner to make it fit into this space. So, but I will do it in mobile for now. We can come back to it in full screen later. I'm not a big fan of mobile first, just FYI. It in theory it's a great idea, but what I've found is you tend to find that you have more complex layout in full screen view than you do in mobile view. Mobile tends to be just like single column, and it's much easier to get multiple using like the flex system and whatever else you might use, it's much easier to go from multiple column layouts to one than it is to go from one to multiple, because there's all the it's more of a layout thought with the mobile, with the desktop. So I don't think mobile first works. Not for me. I'd rather do desktop first and then shrink it to mobile later. But for the purposes of this, we'll just leave it on mobile for now. Again, this is more just prototyping the idea rather than a final kind of vision of what it is. It's more the logic. I want to be able to get the logic at the end of this and stick it into any other PHP setup, and effectively the core logic is the same. So that's kind of where I'm going with this. Obviously, we're going to use Laravel's helpers and kind of framework to do that. But that's kind of where I am with that. So okay, here we're going to run npm run dev. So this should now load up to this one, which means if I reload this page, if I register, there we go. So I'm now registered into the dashboard, and all of this just comes out the box with the Jetstream system. This is a view thing in Inertia. And it just makes it really quick. I don't have to faff around with all of that. That's what I like about it. Cool. So let's go back to where we are then. We're going to use the user as a player, because in Laravel, where are we? Database migrations. So we get the users table here. So that can be the player. Now in this game, we are going to be using the map system, which means we're going to have locations on a map. Now, the storyline behind this is that in this dystopian future, although trains don't work because the infrastructure's just kind of damaged the rail system, the electricity distribution to rail stations is still intact. So every train station still has been given access to the electrical supply, which means that train stations can be the point where we travel to and from. Now, if we're not going to use trains, then I thought, well, the best way we can do this is maybe we have drones, and we have remote flying drones that can fly from point to point, irrespective of the terrain, so long as there's a charging point at the end, and the charging point being the stations, the train stations. So that's going to be the way the structure of the journey works of these drones. So a player owns drones. Drones move about between stations. They charge up at the stations. They then need a purpose. Why have we got these drones? So I thought, well, if you're familiar with the Deuteros storyline, the beginning of Deuteros is, the beginning of Deuteros, if we go back to the walkthrough, this is to do with building your infrastructure up to the point where you can, there we go. So he's built a shuttle here, installs a tool pod, and eventually launches into the atmosphere to build one of these in the orbit of Earth. He's actually got to the moon at this point. I think you can repair the one at the moon, or you build the one at the moon and go to it. So there, I can't remember. So we're going to build one of these orbital factories. That's kind of the end game for our game, which then fits in nicely to the beginning game of Deuteros. So what I thought was, if we look at the resources of what we get access to,
and check it out, we've now got a space station. It's not doing
there. So these are the resources that kind of the game offers, but iron, titanium, aluminium, carbon, copper, hydrogen, deuterium, and methane are the only ones that are available on Earth. And because we're only playing on Earth, we only need to include them. And equally, we only need to include the production items that can be produced on Earth. If you go to the production workshop, this is the tech workshop, but only these first few items that can be built on Earth are what we need, because we're not doing anything in space. Because the game will be won once the orbital factory is built. That's my idea. That's my idea for the game. So, that being the case, the drones could basically be carriers of these resources. Now, whereas at this point we're dealing in tons, which we'll assume are 1,000 kilos ton. With the drones, obviously we're dealing with smaller machines. They could just deal with kilos, so we're dealing with 1,000th of that, which then kind of makes the game, because we're dealing with kilos and not tons, it makes the game 1,000 times bigger, because 1,000 things need to be moved in our game compared to what will need to be done in this game. But that makes sense, because in this game you're scaling out to the solar system and you need all that more access to stuff. Whereas in our game, moving a kilo of stuff around is ample. That'll be fine. There'll be enough work to do that, and to make the game give the game enough longevity in order to satisfy that. So that's kind of what I'm thinking of there. So we have our drones. They move from station to station, which have charging points. The drones carry resources. So we need to think about how the resources are perhaps going to be developed as well. We'll come back to that. We now know that we can have drones and that a user can have drones. So there's a relationship we can build. Now, ordinarily, if I was building this up, I might kind of build it incrementally and kind of think, oh, yeah, we'll do that bit and then we'll come back and we'll do the next bit. The problem with that bit is, or the problem with that is that sometimes you lose your focus in the far end, the far distance of what you're aiming for. And I'm a big fan of many of Adam Wathan's presentations on Loricon and other stuff he's done before he was into the Tailwind stuff, because he was one of the founders of Tailwind, but if not the founder. But he was big into Laravel and stuff before then. And he did one of his presentations. I can't remember which one it was, but it was to do with testing, and I think it was called Chasing Perfection. I'm not sure. He did a few on testing, but anyway, what he said was, when he likes to build something, his first test, he likes to build a test that just cuts right across what the app is largely doing. Now, obviously, our app, if it gets to fruition, is going to be fairly big if we ever make it to the end. But a core part of that app is this idea that drones move about and carry resources. We could certainly use that as a fundamental part of what our drones are doing. So what I would like to do is, as a developer, what I'm now thinking is, let's create a test that, in Adam Wathan's words, cuts across all of that logic in one go, and then let's build out from that test. So that's what we're going to do today, or we're going to start to do. So what we'll do is we'll go back to our terminal here and we'll create a test. So if I now do sail pest, okay, yeah, so we have all our tests. Now these tests are the ones that come with Jetstream. We want to now create our new test to cut across this idea of what the app is doing. So because I've kind of been messing around with this for a few weeks trying to get an idea as to how I want this to work, I've already got some ideas in my head. And what we're going to do is we're going to obviously adopt the mentality of models are nouns in the Laravel system. So a user is a noun, obviously. A drone was going to be a noun. But we need that idea of the movement of the drone from one place to another. We kind of need to store that as a noun as well. So you can think of a number of words: journey, trip, jaunt, um, you know, there's loads of words. I'm going to go with trip because it's just easy, and I'm kind of thinking in the future, because the drones have range, the trip is kind of the single point from point to point, but you may end up having like a journey, which is like a collection of trips. If you can kind of send your drone out beyond its initial range, and part of that journey it has to stop and recharge as part of that journey. I haven't quite worked that one out yet as to how that would work in the playability of it. But I think for now, at least, we'll just call it trip. And um, yeah, I don't see why not. Let's do that trip. So on that basis, then our test is going to look like this. Oh, we also follow the cruddy by design methodology again. Adam Wathan's, as far as I'm concerned, ingenious way of structuring your code, but I'll not go into that in any detail other than when we need to. But I'm going to do my make test, make it a pest test, and then we're going to store a trip. Okay, but the trip, because we're storing it, it needs to belong to something else first, because technically it doesn't exist until it's stored. So the trip needs to belong to some other noun. So the only other two nouns we're aware of at the minute are the user and the drone. And I kind of think it should belong to the drone. The trip should belong to the drone because it's the drone making the trip, not the user. It just happens to belong to the user. But if the drone belongs to the user and the trip belongs to the drone, then you can get your association to the user that way anyway. So yeah, so what we're going to do is follow the cruddy by design. So it's going to be the drone folder. Then it's going to be the trip folder. And then inside the trip folder, we're going to do a store test. So which means we can create as many tests as we want relating to the storing of this trip. So that's where my mind is at with this. So if I now bring that up, why is it tiny? Oh, it's because this needs to go, doesn't it? Yeah. Okay, so we have our store test. Okay, so let's see. Test a trip can be stored. Now, a lot of what I do is based on my previous experience with this, and I'm going to say right now, TDD is a highly contentious topic. There are purists out there that will say there's only one way of doing it. There are people out there who've kind of looked at it a different point of view and say TDD actually hinders in some ways. I have done a lot of research on this, and I'm not going to get into the debate, but I do have a certain way how I do my tests. Feel free to adopt it, abandon it, do whatever you want, but this is what works for me. And I've run this by numerous other people who have kind of said, yeah, that makes sense. So this isn't just my thoughts, but you might like it, you might not. If you're more of a purist with testing, good for you. I can't get it making any better than what I'm going to do, but I'm happy with what I do with this. So let's see how we can get on. So when I'm doing tests, I won't do this with every test, but I'll just kind of do it with the first few just to get the ball rolling. So what I like to do is create the three sections of given. I have these tiny up arrow buttons. There we go. Given, when, and then. Now I've kind of borrowed these from the use cases methodology, so I don't know whether it's appropriate, but it seems to fit for me here. So given, when, and then. So given a set of circumstances, when I do this, then I expect this result. That's how we're going to be building our tests. Okay, so what are the set of circumstances? Well, we'll come back to that in a second. Let's do in what we want to do. We're creating a test, we're storing it, and in the Laravel methodology, that's a post. And remember, we're in drone/trip, so we can say drones. We need to know what the drone is, don't we? So what we're going to do is do %s/ drones trips. There we go. So that will post a trip against this particular drone. Now that %s is there because I'm going to wrap this inside an sprintf. Okay, but that means I need to put something here to make what that s is. So let's go and say drone get key. You could just use ID if you want, but I don't know. Something about saying get key feels a bit nicer. So we have our drone get key, but we don't have a drone. So now we need to start populating our given section because we need a drone to store a trip against. So we'll do drone equals drone, which doesn't exist. We'll create one in a factory. This is a Laravel specific call here. And we'll create that drone. So this is obviously going to fail. Test run fine. So great, we have a fail, class drone not found, which we expected. So let's make that. Let me just narrow that a bit. It doesn't need to be that wide. There we go. So let's make that sail artisan make model okay, I'll explain these out in a sec. Policy drone. Okay, so MFS, M means we create the relevant migration, which is kind of a common thing you do. F is the factory, because we want to be able to do that for our testing. And S is the seeder, if we want to do that as part of the seeder. We probably won't. I tend to do a lot of the seeding in like one file for the live stuff, but you never know. It's just nice to have it there in case. And now purists amongst the community will be saying, "Oh, you don't know if you need it. You shouldn't be creating it." I know that, but what I've found is that inevitably I end up doing it anyway in most cases. So I'm just going to build it. It's a habit I've got into. The same with policy. I'm not going to use the policy anytime soon, but I know I'm going to use it. I know it's going to happen. I'm not that ignorant of how this will pan out. So for me, I'm happy to create it now, and I'll come back to it and I'll adjust it as and when I need it. So that's how I create my models. So now I should have a drone model. In fact, if I just go to here and import class, it's imported my model's drone. Okay, so let's run the test again. Oh, typo. Okay. Create there. Okay, controller. Expects this response, status code, what receive 404, failed to take that 404, set it equal to 200. Okay, so this is what we expected. It has no idea of this URL we're calling here in the code, so that's good. Because now we can create it. Now, the idea behind the way I look at this is you just create the bare minimum. So you see the way here, the default Laravel dashboard doesn't have a controller. It's just here in the root file. That's absolutely fine. That's fine. That's what we're going to do until such point as maybe we want to refactor. It's absolutely fine to put it in here. So we're going to say root. We know it's a post method. So now following our Laravel convention, we went to drones. We passed in a drone, so root model binding will kick in here. And then we did trips. Excellent. So at this point, we could point to a controller, create a controller and point to it. But for now, we're just going to do a closure. And what we can say is we can draw in that drone from the binding. And yeah, we're also going to want to pull in the request. REQU, which one is it? I think is it that one? Let's see what happens if we pull in that one. Okay, and let's close that off. Okay, we need to import the drone here. Okay, so let's run request. Okay, so we don't have a 404, we have a 302. Now this is interesting because, think about this, we have said that we want to get a 200, but we don't. Whenever you post data and change, you want it to give you a 302 because you want it to transfer somewhere else. You don't want it to come back with the result in the post endpoint that you've given. So in actual fact, we should change this to 302. And as you can imagine, what's going to happen now is the test passes. And this is the bit that took me a while to get my head around. The test passes, but we know it's broken, as in we know it's not done. And this is where we've got to kind of get into the mentality of what tests are for. Tests don't show that your code does the expected result. It just simply confirms that it's not broken. It's hard to give an analogy really, other than say, if I said to you, 2 plus, if you give me a sum and you said what's 2 plus 2 and I said 5, I've followed the protocol of answering a sum, but I've given you the wrong answer, but I've still followed the protocol. If you say what's 2 plus 2 and I say banana, or some other abstract idea, well, that's broken, isn't it? That doesn't make sense. Whereas 2 plus 2 equals 5, it's not broken in the sense of it doesn't complete what it's trying to do. It just gives you the wrong answer. So it's good to remember that when you're doing tests. Getting your tests to pass is good. Don't get me wrong, it is good. But it doesn't mean everything about your code is working, because quite clearly we've just proven that here. And that's why you need to have a suite of tests to cover different scenarios. But I'm happy with this test now. This test passes. We don't need to add to it. But for the sake of laziness, I'm going to say a trip can be stored, and then say we want to return back to something. So, or do we want to return back to the drone that has the trip, or to the trip itself? Let's return to the trip for now. No, because it's going to break the test if I change it later. Do I want to return the trip or the drone? Let's return the drone. Okay, so given a drone, so what we're doing now is we're saying, well, what happens after it's done its redirect? In Laravel, what we're saying now is we want to follow redirects, which means we now expect to get 200 from wherever we're redirected to. Let's run the test. Test passes. My mindset now, again, this is my preference as a developer, is once I get a test to a working point, I want to add that to the repo. Again, even if the test says 2 plus 2 equals 5, it doesn't matter to me. And here's my reasoning on this. If I was working in a team, then at some point, the code I commit is going to end up in front of a team member. It's it's just the inevitability. So I want to create the code in such a way that as soon as they pick it up, as soon as they run it on their Docker, they can just get it set up on their Docker, run the test, and it works. That's it. It should just work. There's no brokenness about it. I'm not saying it's finished and complete. It's still 2 plus 2 equals 5, potentially, but it works. One of the annoying things I found as a developer was picking up code and it didn't even work. And so you spent an hour just simply trying to debug things that should work. So while I'm building my tests at the beginning and creating my code that passes the tests, then effectively what I'm saying is to anybody who wants to come and work on this, including myself in the future, it will just work. It might not work correctly, but it will just work. And for me, it's more important that it works than it works correctly but be broken in parts, because you can deal with that better. If it's broken in parts, you have no idea why it's broken. You don't know how deep that rabbit warren goes when it comes to fixing it. I just don't want to go there. Whereas at least if I know if it works, all I have to do is look through the suite of tests and go, okay, they're the tests it's checking. Oh, he's not checking for that. He's not checking for that. She's not checking for that. They're not checking for that. At least I can then implement my own tests to cover things that maybe other people have worked have covered. But at least it works. At least it works. So that's the way I look at it. If you get tests working, add it to your commit. That's the way I look at it. So we don't alter a test. It's very rare. I mean, I did say in this case, if I decide to return something different, then this test becomes invalid. So there are occasions that maybe you have to go back and alter a test, but that's usually because of it's not because the test didn't work in the first place. It's because the requirements have changed. Fair enough. I mean, you could even put a variable in this as to what page you return, but I'm not going to do that. So then we can say, okay, we're returning the drone. We can now start using the assertable features of Laravel, and Inertia comes with its own set of assertable calls that you can do. Pretty cool, actually. So I can say assert Inertia, and then using one of these fancy doodah FN calls, I can say I can create an instance here of that assertable inertia, and now I can do calls on it, and I can check things related to the inertia infrastructure. So first thing I usually do is check that it's calling the right component to load after it's done the redirect. So the way we do that is we say component, and then we just put the path to the component. So I've said that I want this to return the drone, so that means it's going to go to the drone show component. So again, following this cruddy by design methodology, we have the drone noun, and then we have the show, which relates to the show methods of the controller of the CRUD. So that's where that comes from. We might go into more detail in that in a future time. Let's run the tests. Fail. Okay, so now we hit our first point to do with authentication. So the redirect, we said, yeah, we want to go to drone show, but it's actually saying, no, you're going to auth login, which means it doesn't like who we are as a user. No offense. However, it's easily fixed because the testing system gives us an easy way just to authenticate us. We can worry about authorization later on, which is who owns what, who has access to what. But for now, we just need to say we're a legitimate user. So we can say this inside the test, acting as, and then what we can do is we can create the user variable here equals user, go to app models, factory, create. Oh, create. There we go. So that's part of our given. The circumstances are we are logged in as this user, and that is who we are acting as in an authenticated way. Let's run the test. Not a valid inertia response. Okay, so it's expecting inertia, something or other here, but the actual endpoint isn't returning anything. So let's return a response here. Again, my lazy writing. So we said we're going to return drone show. That's what we're expecting in the test. So I run the test again. Inertia page component file drone show does not exist. Of course, we haven't created it here. So let's create that. Let's see, resources, JS, pages. So what we will do now here is create another folder, drone. I do everything in singular as much as I can when it comes to naming. And then inside here we do the show view component. Composition API, excellent. Yeah, let's close that again. Let's run the tests. Test passes. So what do? We add it to Git. So let's just run the status, see what files we're dealing with. Yeah, fine with that. We can now do git add. Just add all the files here, not a problem. Git commit. You can set this up on PHP Storm, but I just feel this is a cluttered screen, so I don't really want to do that. And the test. Now, so what I do here is I write the name of the test. So drone trip store test. Now you can write some more stuff in. If you just do git commit without the -n, you get an edit screen. You can write that in, and then you can write more detail underneath. And I would recommend that, but I'm not doing this for this because I know what I'm doing here. But the point is, in the commit line, I do the test, because what happens is when you come back to this later and you want to say, why did they do that commit? Well, you can say, well, I did that commit because it was satisfying that test. So then you go to that test and say, well, what was that test doing? And then you can see all the files you've changed. We changed these 3 files in that test. And so you can look and say, that commit specifically was making that functionality work based on what that test was trying to achieve. So I just find putting the test name in the commit somewhere is going to be very beneficial to some future me or future dev who's going to look back and say, what was that commit for? So that's why I do it as the name of the test. We have passing tests, and we have, let's have a look at what our tests are doing. Just get ourselves up to speed here. So our test is creating a trip and then returning the drone. Now we know our clever brain is telling us that this route is doing nothing. So we know that even though our tests are passing, this test is not complete because it's not actually doing anything. So we need to tell our test to check in such a way that it forces that endpoint to do something. We know it has to do something, but we don't write the code yet. We write the test that forces us to write the code that we know we need to write. So how can we do that? Well, what we can do is inside this assertable here, we have a simple method called has, and the has method is saying, I expect this to be something that's returned as part of this response. So as we said, we want to view the drone. I would expect to have a drone object. I think that's reasonable. So let's run the test. Okay. Property drone does not exist. Well, we knew that. That's fine. Let's go to the call. So we need to add some data here. Now, if you really want to extract this out to the ultimate degree, what I'm going to do now is going to look a bit silly if you're not familiar with how testing works. This is going to pass the test. Okay? And the reason for that is what we're checking is that the drone property exists. Well, it does. Put whatever we want in it. The drone property exists. So our test passes. We can go to our terminal and we can say, let's just check. Yep, we've altered something other than the test file. Sometimes you'll alter the test file and it already satisfies your code. Maybe you've just like jumped the gun on something. I don't bother committing in that case. So I'm just going to commit that. Same test file, so that's fine. Okay, but we still know this isn't right. But we're getting there. And this is important to remember that testing isn't about getting to the result as quick as possible. In fact, the whole test-driven development has nothing to do with speed. It doesn't speed things up. It doesn't actually slow things down, not in the complete life cycle of your code. What it does, do you know what? It's interesting. It's not even about checking that your code works. That's kind of a spin-off. Testing, because you're doing it in such small increments, what testing does is it allows you to write code in such a way that it's easy to test by definition. And because it's easy to test, then it's easier to break down and look at in a future time. Now again, this starting to fall into that Venn diagram circle of contentiousness, and I have an opinion on this. You know, I've looked at both sides of the argument. I'm not a purist, and I will never be a purist when it comes to TDD, especially on the original spec, but I believe it has its place. I've seen the downsides of TDD. It definitely stifles creativity if you do it kind of as the purist would have you do it. It just does, and that point I will argue because I've experienced that myself. But it's still good. You've still done one code that breaks. I mean, if you can say, yeah, I've run a series of tests on something, then if it does break, at least you can say, well, I tried. It wasn't just my freestyle mind coming up with some code. At least you can say you tried. But at this point, we know that this code is not correct. So again, we need to go back to our test and say, right, well, how do I force that to be what I want it to be? Well, we have the details of the drone here. So this drone object exists. So we can start comparing this drone object with what it should be. So for example, we can create another one of these fancy doodah things. I don't even know what the right terminology is for what these are. It's one of these new abbreviated functions, isn't it? If you're not familiar with this concept as well, this variable can be whatever you want. So you can call this whatever you want, as long as it's consistent. And you'll notice that because this one is nested one layer in from this one, then their scope derived. So they are not, that is not the same variable as that. It just so happens I call it the same. Because this is inside the scope of this call and this is outside the scope of that call, they don't overlap. So you could call it something else if you want to keep clarity visually, but as far as the code is concerned, they are separate calls, separate variables. So I'm going to say that this drone, rather than just simply say it has some information, I'm going to say it equals some information. So the way I do that is I can say where the ID equals the drone ID that I have. So remember, what you're checking here, this ID is the ID that's returned from the call under this drone property. That's what's returned from the call. This, what you compared it to, is what we had here in the first place. So essentially what we're comparing is that this drone that we sent the data up for is what's sent back here, and that's what we want to see, which is ultimately what we said. We want to return back the drone after it's done its change. So if we run this test, it's going to fail because it says drone does not exist, ID does not exist, which we know. Let's go to the test, go to the root. So now this isn't good enough. The test is forcing us to do something more. So as a quick fix, we can just return the drone object. That'll pass the test. Oh, yeah, okay. It's passed that test. What I need to mention is this here. What this is saying is that, okay, you've tested, if I go back to the test here, you've tested that the ID equals something, but by the way, this model has other data in it that you need to deal with. You can't just ignore it. Now, there's two things we can do here. We can either itemize each of the ones we want to check, that it exists or that it has a value of a certain thing, or we can ignore it, but we have to explicitly ignore any fields that we're not interested in. And at this moment for this test, I don't really care about the created that and updated that. It's not relevant to me right now. So the easiest way to ignore everything else, once you've checked all the fields you want to ignore, I say the easiest, it's probably the only way, is we use the etc method, and that will just ignore any other fields that come back in the drone object. So now the test passes. So we are happy that the test is returning the drone, but we still haven't confirmed that the trip has been stored. So we basically now need to say that the drone is, well, we've got one of two things we can do here. We can either abandon this and go back to say show the trip, which is going to force us to create the trip. Or we can say, well, hang on, the trip does belong to the drone, so maybe we can check that the drone has a trip that matches the criteria of the trip we sent up. That might work. So how would we do that? Well, has drone, we would say within here, within the drone has a trip. And okay, we need to chat about this a minute. Like I say, in the past I've been kind of working with rough ideas of how this might pan out. So usually with relationships in Laravel, if it's a plural, it's a has many. So a drone has many trips. And we know a drone is going to have many trips because a drone, by nature of its activity, is going to accumulate those. But I was thinking about redundancy of data. We could say that a drone is at a particular place and time, and we could store that information against the drone. And whenever we move the drone by means of a trip, then we update the drone data. But if you think about it, there's a bit of a redundancy of data there because the trip is going to have the start point and the end point as part of its trip data. That makes sense to do that. So if the trip has an end point, that's the point the drone is going to go to. So if we don't want to have redundant data, in other words, if we don't want more than one source of truth, we can't really store that information on the drone. because the trip has it. But then the question would be, if there's many trips, how do you know which is the trip related to where the drone currently is? As I say, I've done a lot of thought on this already. So yes, you will have trips, which we'll come to at some point in our process. But we also need to have a singular, a has one, shall we say. And we need to have that one trip, which is in the singular, which is this one, which is deemed to be the trip that is the last or latest trip that a drone has done. Because that means that will give us the current location of either where the drone is or where the drone is flying towards at this current point in time. Now, the game, you can set future trips, and I envisage that's going to happen, especially when we do those journey things that we talked about earlier. We're going to, no doubt, have a journey, which will be trips, multiple trips. But the trip itself is one that is either in action, so the drone is actually flying as we speak towards this destination, or it's the last completed trip that the drone did. So it's not a trip that you plan, that it hasn't been on yet. It's a trip that it's on, or it's a trip that it was last on. If we think about that in logic terminology, we're talking about a trip. If we had an arrived at field, which would be a date time, we're talking about the trip that has an arrives at field, so it's not empty, because planned trips won't have that in, because you haven't gone yet, so you don't know when you're going to arrive. So the arrived at field needs to be not empty, but it needs to be ordered by the highest arrived at. And that will either be the current trip that it's on now, or the last trip that it actually did. So then when you get the location to from that trip, that must be either where the drone is heading towards or where the drone is by definition. So I hope that kind of makes sense. So because of that, this trip, now we said this test was going to cut across a large part of the code. Well, for this part of the site, it is. It's going to cut a large part. So this has taken quite a while to build, but this is the point. This trip will now tell us, A, that the trip's been done, and B, where the drone is or is going to at any given point in time. So we need to have a has trip on here, and that's going to help us do that. So if we run the test, it's going to fail because there is no trip. So now we can say, well, okay, let's build that trip out. So we know in this function we have to do something in order to create that trip. So we need to know where it's going to create a trip. Remember, we're not making it a trip where the drone's actually moving, we're just planning this trip at this point. I know that is confusing compared to what we've just said. Let's just do this. Let's just do this, and then we'll plan this out. It's hard to explain, but I have got a working model of this somewhere, so I know it kind of works. So let's create a trip first of all. We can refactor this later. So trip equals trip. Trip create, and let's see, what parameters are we going to need? Well, we said the to parameter, didn't we? So let's assume we've got a to ID. So to ID equals, that'll come in from the request. So let's just say request get to ID. Now the reason why I'm not using normal Laravel convention here and specifying the name of the model underscore ID is because a trip is going to have a from and a to. So rather than say, well, which one should take the name of the model, I'm just going to call them from ID and to ID. And then in the relationships, you can explicitly set that in the models when we get to it. But it also means now that I don't have to worry about what that model is called. as to what the location is, although it probably call it location. So we have a trip here. The trip has no knowledge of itself. We need to go back to the test though, because we need to send that to ID. So the way we can do that, we can force the trip here. We can say trip equals trip factory. We'll do raw. So we're not actually creating it in the database, but we're creating the data that needs to be sent up. Let's see what the test brings back on that. Yeah, class trip not found. Okay, let's close that down. We can now add that here. Oh, no, it's not. Has it found it yet? There we go. We can add the trip there. We run the test again. Okay, so class trip not found. So now we're in the actual code. So we can import that there. Let's run the test again. Okay, to ID to the fillable property of trip. Okay. So if we load up the trip model, we can say fillable equals to ID. Run the test again. Okay, unknown column to ID. So now we need to start just altering the data structure here. So if we go to trips, table, so what's that going to be? It's going to be, now it will be a foreign ID, but we do not have the relationship set up yet. So for now I'm just going to call it an integer, but we will convert that to a foreign key once the associated model is available. To ID cannot be null. Okay, so again, I'm just going to add a nullable in here. It will be nullable because, oh no, it won't. No, it will have a to ID. So in that case then, why would it be nullable? So I'm sending the trip. I haven't sent the trip, that's why. So let's just get rid of that. When I've done the post here, I've not sent the data, which goes in here. So I need to send the trip here. So to ID cannot be null. Okay. This is interesting. So let's see. To ID cannot be null. So we're sending. We haven't added to ID to the factory. So if we go to the trip factory, and we can just add. Now again, we don't have the model it relates to, so I'm just going to use a random number between 1 and 100. But we do need to come back to that. Failed asserting that false is true. Okay, so now we need to return the drone relationship. We can go to drone. Let's create a, oh no, let's do it the right way around. Let's go to web. we want to return drone, but we want to load the trip relationship. This will now say the relationship doesn't exist. Yeah, and now we can create that. So now we can say public function trip. So remember the logic we mentioned earlier. It's return this has one trip okay, but it has to be the latest one. So we say, well, it has to be one where we don't have an arrived at field yet, do we? So for now, it's just going to be the latest one. Well, we don't even have an arrived field to order. No, it's just going to be the class. But again, hopefully our test will bring us back to this, because that's obviously not working correctly, but our job is to pass the test. So unknown column trips drone ID in where clause. Okay. So if I go to now, so we can do a foreign key here. I was hoping to get this kind of finished when I have a break. Just put a constraint on that. Field drone ID doesn't have a default value. Okay, so what we need to do here is go back to the trip factory. So okay, so we need to go drone ID, and then we can just do drone get key. There we go. Must be near to the end of this test now, I'm sure. Oh, no. Drone ID doesn't have a default value. Insert into trips. Okay. So drone ID. So is that because we need to put drone ID here? There we go. But that's why Adam Wathan's idea of cutting across a whole load of logic is you get a lot done in one test, and we can build on this later. Right, so we've now got the code to return back the fact that the drone has a trip. But as we've seen when I tried to build the trip, quite clearly it's not going to work when more and more trips are created, because there's no way of determining that it's the right trip, what the logic we talked about earlier. So we could do with kind of bottoming that out really. Let's just refactor a little bit here. So here's what I like to do with refactor them. I'm not going to put this into a controller until I'm kind of close to where I want it to be. Hopefully that'll be by the end of today's stream, but we'll see. We don't need that because the actual variable isn't used. We can replace that qualifier, and let's see, we're okay there. Let's get rid of these qualifiers. Okay, yeah, looks good. So then what I would do now is, I mean, this is optional. I wouldn't suggest this. You look at the status. We have changed the test, but it was just refactoring. So what you could, under my kind of guidelines, what I've suggested, you could say you could do that because you've changed the test and you've changed something in the file, but you haven't actually you've done a refactor. So that it doesn't kind of distract people later on. Because if you put refactor, what it means is that there's nothing critical changed in this, nothing that's kind of going to determine why something no longer works. So I just like to put refactoring, which kind of takes the importance away from that particular commit. But at least it commits it into its own separate file. That's just my logic in that. We haven't even bothered done anything visual yet, which is fine. Which is fine. We wanted to concentrate on the business logic, and that's what we're going to do. So far so good, but we need to determine that we're pulling back the right trip when there's multiple trips. So can we add to... Oh, I'll show you a little thing I've been doing as well as part of the refactor actually. So in this test we have given, when, and then. The when pulls in the results of the call into this variable, and then it does its magic on the assertions from that. What I kind of have got into the habit of doing is this. So get rid of that variable, get rid of the semicolon, get rid of the variable here, and then just tab it in one. So this effectively is just chained onto that now, and that'll still work fine. We'll do the same down here. Get rid of this response variable. It's just a little bit less code in the actual file then, isn't it? Get rid of that. Get rid of that, and then just tab all of this in one more like that, and that'll still work. Okay, so we now need to create a scenario where let's see. Actually, we need to go back a bit here because we said before that a drone's location is based on its last trip. So that means, in reality, in order to prevent errors or edge cases, whenever a drone is created, there should always be at least one trip created with it in order to determine where its current location is. So I think what we'll do in that regard is we'll just go in. We need a test to create that. We need to get to a point where whenever a drone's created, a trip is created, but we may have to do that on another test. Anyway, just bear that in mind. So we need to check that the trip has and arrives at which is null at the time it's created, because we're not committing to the trip, we're just creating a trip at that point. So we can say in our test, we can just build on from this current test, and we can throw another one of these fancy doodahs in. And we can say, so where and we'll do it in good old-fashioned Laravel style in the past tense. So we're arrived at. Now, it has to be null. The one you're creating has to be null because we're not committing to the trip at the time we create it. It allows for us to plan the trip more extensively in a future part of the game without committing to the trip. So we need to make sure the arrived at is null at the time we create the trip. Now, as there's more fields in this, we need to put an etc in there as well for now, just to stop it throwing that error we had earlier. So it says arrived at does not exist, and we knew that. So let's first of all go to the migration, and let's put this at the bottom. So table, there was an argument about whether you should use date time or timestamp. I can't remember what the result of it was, so I'm just going to use date time for now. But if anybody can tell me why I should use timestamp instead. Be very grateful for that. Now, we know this can be null because we can plan a trip without having a definite time of arrival. So let's put that as nullable. I think that will do for this test. Yeah, because it's nullable, it doesn't matter. So we've tested. What did we actually test there? We tested that the arrived at is null. So that's fine. The arrived at is null. But have we actually tested that it's the right trip? So what we're going to do now, I'm going to create a trip here. And this is the trip that is always with a drone, not the one we're trying to create now. So factory, create, and we're going to put drone ID get key. All right. So yeah, remember everybody, this is the one that is just inherent with each drone, whereas this is the one we're creating. Now you'll notice deliberately, well not deliberately, but we just haven't got to the point yet where we're associating this trip with this drone. So hopefully we're going to be able to write a test to do that, because at the minute this trip has no idea about this drone. That's obviously not going to work going forward. So let's see what we can do here. Okay, so we've created that trip. So we've got drone trip, which is fine. We now trip factory. Oh yeah, I just want to double check that. Does trip factory create an arrived at? Yes. Let's put one in. Actually, no, let's set it, but let's set it to null. Although that won't check. No, that we still can't check our. Let's sub an hour. Okay, so failed asserting that a date is identical to null. That's what we wanted. Okay. So what we're saying is that this trip should have a date, which it does, but this trip shouldn't. So we need to say arrived at is null on this one. Hopefully this will fail because I don't want this to be the end of it. So yeah, it's now saying that it's got a date and it should be null, and that's because the trip it's pulling back is this one. And it's pulling back this one because it has no concept of this one. It doesn't know that this one exists because it's not associated with it. So we can fix that and say, okay, well, I want to... it would be tempting actually to put the drone ID in here as part of the post, but we're actually posting the drone anyway. So it kind of doesn't really make sense to do that. Let's go to the file. We're creating the trip. We've got the drone. We've got that, and we're returning the drone load the trip. Now, it is possible that it's loading the first trip, which hasn't arrived at, because it will, if you don't put a load order, I think it just loads it in the order as it was put in. Now, remember earlier when we were looking at that, we knew we'd have to change it, and it looks like now we're going to have to change it. So here, let's see if we can put our criteria in. So the first thing we need to do for a past trip is we need to say where not null. A past or current trip has to have an arrived at, and then we need to order by it. So it's the latest and that would be in descending order. Okay, so it's still not happy. I've just had a thought about this. I think that's because we might be checking for the wrong thing in the test. So we've created a trip with the drone, that's fine. What we're checking now is that we don't need to check that the trip, the associated trip with the drone is null, because that should never be null. That will always return incorrect. What we need to do is check something else. We need to check that there's another variable on the drone called a planned trip. Is that an underscore or is that snake case when you do a relationship? Don't know. Let's try it. So we know this is going to fail. We'll run the test anyway, just so that we know. Okay, so drone plan trip does not exist. That's fine. If we go to the drone model, okay, so public function I know this is camel case. Public function trip. So what we can do, let's just return a copy of this. Okay, we can say it has one trip where the arrived at is null, and we will eventually kind of need to say and where the from location is where the drone is now, because if we get to the point where we do a journey and we have multiple planned trips, the from locations for them are not going to be where the drone is, because it's going to be where it is after the first trip or the second trip. But for now we don't have that ability because we haven't set up those location models. So we're just going to leave it as this for now. We've got planned trip. Let's see if that pulls up in the test. Okay, planned trip does not exist. I have a suspicion. Yay! I knew there was one combo that worked. Let's get rid of that. So what we've established is that the planned trip exists. The planned trip has an arrived at as null. We know that this arrived at is not null because the trip factory, we've put a date on there. And so we know that that's null. So we know that the trip was created. So our test has passed. Yay! Okay, cool. I think now for the rest of this session, I think it'd be good to get the location thing set up. And I keep saying location, so I think it's going to be the word. It's going to be a location as a model. So let's see if we can do that in a test. So a trip can be stored. Can we do this within this test? So the trip, what we're going to send is so the only thing we do is that. So at the minute we're just sending a random. So that's no good. We need to create the model, but we can do that without creating the new test, because what we can do is say this 2ID actually needs to be location factory. So now this is going to error. Location not found. Looks good. Let's close that down. App models locations. Let's run that test again. Passes the test. Yeah, I kind of thought that would happen. I think what we'll do as well is we'll just alter the migrations as well, I think. So we can say foreign. Oh, yeah. So what we need to do here is just change the constrained lightly. It's slightly constrained is table and column. So we say locations ID. Oh, the default is ID, so that's fine. We don't need to do that, so we can just say locations. Ooh, big fail. Big fail. And the reason for that is it's one of these annoying things with the migrations is if you create a header file after, like a dependency file, a migration that's dependent on another table for its data as a header, but you create it before it, the other table hasn't had time to be created, and so when it tries to create the foreign constraint, it fails. So in other words, because a trip depends on a location, the location has to be before the trip. So what I find myself doing occasionally, I do wish there was another way of doing this, but I just have to rename the file to a date that's before the one I want it to be. So I want the location file to be before the trip file. So the trip file is 0927. So I can just change it to 0909. The location's not dependent on anything. No, so that should be okay. So if I refactor that, it moves the location up. If I run the test back, that's fine. So that's all what that is. Just occasionally have to do that. I kind of think the from ID needs to be set based on the drone's trip ID though. So what we can do is with a planned trip, we can say actually let's check the to ID while we're here because we know we should have that now. So where to ID equals trip this should pass. Yeah. But we can also check the from ID. So the from ID, remember we said to avoid redundancy, it should be the to ID of the current trip, or what we call trip on the drone, because it might not be actual current, it may have passed. So we can get that by saying drone trip. We don't want the relationship to ID. So remember, this is the to ID of the last trip. Kind of makes sense that that's the from ID of the next trip because they should join on. So I'm hoping this passes. Ooh. So drone planned trip from ID does not exist. Oh, okay, yeah, because we haven't actually set that field up, have we? So let's go backwards from here. We go to the web, planned trip. So we'd need to do a from ID here. From ID, and that's going to equal what we just did in the test, which is drone trip to ID. Okay, from ID does not exist, though I think this is now because it's not in the migration. So if we go to the trip migration, yeah, we don't have a from ID there, so we can. So this is why I was saying I haven't called it location ID because they both go to locations, and I didn't want to give one a preference above the other. Field from ID doesn't have a default value, so is that because we need to put it in the, yeah, probably need to just put it in here. Oh. So trip store test 23. Ah, it's the first one, isn't it? So, oh no, it's the second test, 23. So trip factory. Do we need to put something in the trip factory? To ID, okay. All right, passes the test, so yeah, all good. I'm just going to change some stuff over. I don't know how I'm going to test this. It's kind of a refactor, to be honest, because I'm not actually changing any logic. But I've got into the habit of using UUIDs instead of IDs instead of the auto increment. All right, so that's cool. So that means everything should still work here. There's yeah, refresh database. Let's uncomment that. Just going to create a little file here. Tests feature, and then in here, new file, PHP file. So these are just like some of the standardizations I like to bring in. And so in here, I'm just going to paste this. The test is called no request facade. That's what I've called it. And what we're saying is that the HTTP request facade is not to be used in controllers. So if I run this test now, I think everything should still pass because we haven't used it yet. Yeah, so everything's fine. So I'll leave it there, but we're going to come back to that in a minute. Sale, artisan, make controller. So I'm following the CRUD by design methodology again. So remember, it was a trip associated to a drone. So it's a drone's trip. So that means we go from drone, trip, controller. And that means anything inside the drone folder, any controller method needs to have access to a drone parameter passed in. That's what this is. That's what that means. Okay, so now we can, let's just copy this code. So we can copy everything from here to there. So remember, this is the store method. Okay, so if we cut that, we can now refer to that trip controller and to the store method. All right, so far so good. We can then go to this trip controller, public, and then paste, and just put the word store in here. And that's it. So we've obviously got some issues. We can just import some classes here. that one, and that one. Okay, so both of those files look fine. Let's run the tests. Oh, and immediately we have an error. And this now comes back to the arch test, expecting request not to be used in controllers. And yet, by default, our controllers that we make have HTTP request. So we can say that you can't use the generic request in a controller. I quite like that. But it means we've still got a bit more work to do, because if I take that out, I have to take that out, but I need that request because I'm using that here. So now this forces us to create our custom request. So go back to our terminal. Let's just make that. Just copy some of the code that's already here. Drone trip store request, and we can just call that make request. Make request drone trip store request. Excellent. So we can now go to drone trip store request, and the test will pass. Now, as it stands, oh yeah. That's because by default, store drone these requests return false, and I also need to put the parameter in there. So for now we'll put true, and I just need to see what it is it uses, the 2ID. So we are allowed to put in 2ID, and we can say, I like this one, exists in the locations table as an ID in the ID column. And we can say required as well. Nice. Okay, will that pass our test? It does. So what I'm going to do is just do that manually anyway. Validated equals request safe only to ID. And then rather than request get to ID, we use validated to ID. Test will pass. Yeah, it's fine. It's fine. Cool. Let's just see if there's some tidying up we can do. Good idea to do things like adding return types. Just little things that help. You know, this I haven't quite worked out how to stop that little like kind of indicator coming up, the warning that it doesn't exist. I don't know whether you can just ignore that. I mean, you can do. You can add it as a query, and then that does exist. But that's purely for the benefit of the IDE and for the user. I don't think it alters the code. Probably, if anything, slightly slows it, but I don't know. But anyway, we've got a return type in there. We've specified the types of what's going in. So I'm happy with that code. We could put that to a controller, I suppose. Let's do that. We'll call that the dashboard controller. Okay, so we'll do the same again. We'll grab the function up to there, X that out, dashboard controller, and we'll just put it under a show method. I don't really want to get too hung up on the cruddiness of it because it wasn't my page, but as I said, it's there just for prototyping. So if we public, oh no, now I can paste. Show. That will error if I leave it in, even though it's not being used. We can put a return type in there. Let's run those tests. Yeah, that's fine. Okay, so I'm happy with that file. The arch test we don't need. Let's put some return types on here. Oh, I've made a boo-boo. Because we shouldn't return. Okay. Yes, we've made a boo-boo here. So, okay, so what's the test telling us? It's saying that we should follow redirects, which means this should not be a return. So let's comment that out. So I'll just use the shortcut to root, and we'll say drones. We said we were going to show the drone, and we'll put the drone as the parameter. Why are you not happy? Oh. I can't believe it. Schoolboy error there. Okay, so yeah, root drone's not defined. So let's go to the web file. Let's just quickly set that up. So that'll be this one. Root get drone. Okay, so what we can do is go back to the trip controller, copy this code here. Is that gonna work? No. Drone's not showing, not defined. Ah, okay, yeah, so I need to just put a name in there. Okay. Whew. Okay, so what we're going to do, we'll just refactor that into its own controller. So let's make another controller here. So because we're showing the drone now, this can be on the root because it'll have its own ID. So I can just create that on the root. I can copy everything from there to there. O-N-E-C, drone controller, class, and that'll be a show method. I can then go to this drone controller, put my method in, call it show. Done. Get rid of the offending request. And there we are. Woo! Oh yeah. Right, so let's just get that. And we are done. That is it. That is all we're doing for today. Oh, that annoying spare line. I hate that. Wait till next time. Excellent. Thank you. If you've enjoyed what we've gone through today, thanks. Thanks for watching. Any comments, please feel free to send them through. Thank you so much to everybody. See you soon. Bye.